Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the cool stone corridors of a medieval monastery, where the echo of your footsteps is swallowed almost immediately by a hush so complete you start to wonder if sound itself has been banned. The air smells faintly of earth and smoke, with just the tiniest trace of something malty drifting from a courtyard you haven't reached yet. You pull your cloak tighter, though not because of the cold. It's because you suddenly realize you probably wouldn't survive a week in this place. No gossip, no humming, no casual good mornings. Just silence, prayer, and daily chores carried out with lips sealed tighter than a locked cellar door. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's joining me from across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slide deeper into the cloister, walls lit by narrow windows that let in pale slivers of daylight. A bell tolls somewhere in the distance, not loud, not hurried, just a measured note that floats through the courtyard and settles like dust. Around you, monks glide in brown robes, their sandals whispering against flagstones. No one speaks, yet nothing feels incomplete. The silence itself has its own rhythm, its own conversation. Mainstream history confirms that many monastic orders, like the Cistercians and Trappists, practiced strict silence, believing it sharpened prayer and prevented idle sin. Yet here's a quirky tidbit. Silence didn't always mean total muteness. Monks often developed elaborate sign languages, hand gestures for bread, for water, for beer, so they could coordinate without breaking the vow. Imagine running a brewery with a team that only communicates through charades. Efficiency might not be your first guess, but somehow it worked. Historians still argue whether these vows of silence were strictly observed or gently bent when no abbots were watching. Some chronicles suggest chatter was rare but tolerated, while others insist the rules were enforced with almost comical severity. You picture one monk leaning over to whisper a joke, only to have another wave furiously with the silence gesture, like a medieval librarian shushing the entire abbey. You walk with them into the cloister garden. Rows of herbs line the soil, each plant destined for medicine, food, or, most tantalizingly, the brewery. You breathe in mint, sage, and wormwood, not realizing yet that many of these leaves will soon find their way into brewing vats. The monastery hums with stillness, but beneath the quiet is a steady undercurrent of labor. Fields to tend, prayers to recite, and beer to brew. You follow the smell of malted grain down a narrow passage, its walls cool and damp. The sound is minimal, just the scrape of sandals and the occasional creak of wood. Inside, you step into a vaulted room where sunlight filters through high windows, painting long bars of light across barrels and sacks of grain. Here, beer isn't just a hobby, it's a sacred duty, woven into the rhythm of prayer and labor. Mainstream history tells us that monks began brewing not merely for pleasure, but out of necessity. Beer was seen as liquid bread, nourishing, filling, and, importantly, safer than water. The Rule of Saint Benedict, one of the guiding documents of monastic life, encouraged moderation in all things, but made allowances for a measure of drink each day. In many abbeys, that drink meant beer, not to get tipsy, but to stay alive and well while fasting or laboring. A quirky tidbit? Some monasteries brewed different strengths of beer for different occasions. There was a hearty, high-alcohol ale for feast days and guests of honor, and a weaker, small beer for daily consumption, even given to children. Imagine handing your kid a pint of school beer before lessons. It sounds scandalous now, but in an age of questionable water supplies, it was considered sensible. Historians still argue whether monks approached brewing strictly as sustenance or whether they also took pride in flavor and craft. Were they experimenting with recipes for the joy of it, or did taste emerge only as a side effect of perfecting nutrition? Evidence of herbs, spices, and careful brewing logs suggest at least some monks cared deeply about the result. You linger in the brewery, watching silent figures lift sacks of grain with practiced ease, pour water into great wooden vats, and stir with long paddles. No one speaks, yet every motion flows smoothly, like a ritual. You realize that for monks, brewing beer wasn't just about filling cups. It was prayer by another name, an act of devotion that blended discipline, silence, and sustenance into a single daily rhythm. You step out into the monastery's fields, where the silence feels less like an imposed rule and more like a natural part of the landscape. The rows of barley stretch golden under the sun, their stalks swaying like a quiet sea. You trail your hand along the tops, the grains rough and warm against your fingers, and suddenly you understand. Without these fields, there would be no beer, no nourishment, no sacred duty fulfilled. Mainstream history makes it clear that monasteries were often self-sufficient, cultivating their own crops rather than relying on outside markets. Barley and wheat were grown not just for bread, but for brewing, and abbeys became agricultural powerhouses across Europe. The rhythm of prayer was matched by the rhythm of planting, harvesting, and threshing. Work was prayer, and barley was both blessing and responsibility. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some monastic records suggest that fields were sometimes blessed specifically for brewing, with prayers murmured to ensure a good harvest. Imagine kneeling in the dirt, sprinkling holy water on barley while thinking, "Yes, this will be a fine year for ale." Spiritual devotion and very practical thirst, bound up in the same gesture. Historians still argue whether monasteries favored barley exclusively or experimented with mixed grains like spelt, rye, or oats. Some argue that diversity was key for resilience against bad weather, while others insist barley's malt quality made it the obvious first choice. The debate lingers, much like the aftertaste of a too-strong brew. You watch as monks with scythes move rhythmically through the fields, the golden crop falling in neat swathes. The silence is broken only by the soft rasp of blade against stalk, the swish of bundles gathered into arms, and the steady murmur of wind. Even here, the vow of quiet holds, but the work speaks for itself. By the time the sun dips low, carts creak under the weight of grain bound for the cloister. You follow along, dust rising around you, realizing how every sip of monastic beer began right here, in soil, sweat, and silent devotion. The carts rumble into a shadowed outbuilding, a long hall that smells of damp stone and roasting smoke. You step inside and realize this is where the real transformation begins. Barley doesn't leap straight into barrels. It first must be coaxed into malt, and that alchemy happens here, in silence as steady as prayer. Mainstream history records that monks perfected the art of malting, soaking barley in water until it sprouted, then drying it carefully to halt the growth. That sprouting process unlocked the sugars needed for fermentation, the invisible spark that turned grain into drink. Without it, you'd just have soggy porridge. Not exactly the sustenance anyone was hoping for. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some monastic malt houses were designed with hidden vents and tunnels so warm air could be drawn across sprouting grain. This wasn't just functional, it was ingenious medieval engineering. Imagine building an entire secret ventilation system, not for comfort or defense, but to make sure your beer didn't taste like burnt straw. Historians still argue whether monks experimented deliberately with roasting malt to produce darker flavors, or if it was an accidental byproduct of uneven drying. Was that first smoky-tasting beer a happy accident or an intentional innovation? No clear answer survives, though the legacy of malty complexity suggests someone eventually leaned into the accident and claimed it was genius. You watch the monks spread damp grain across the floor in long rows, their sandaled feet crunching softly as they shuffle through. The sprouts glisten pale green, a strange beauty in the dim light. Later, the grain will be shoveled into shallow kilns, smoke curling upward as it dries. The silence holds even here, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of wooden tools. The air grows warm, fragrant, with the earthy sweetness of barley turning to malt. You breathe deeply, realizing this is the hidden foundation of every future sip. A quiet process, slow and steady, unfolding in the shadows of cloistered walls. From the malt house, you follow the monks into a courtyard where stone troughs catch cool water bubbling from a spring. The air is fresher here, crisp with the scent of moss, and you dip your hands into the stream. The cold shocks your skin, and you suddenly understand why water mattered as much as grain in the brewing ritual. Mainstream history tells us that in medieval Europe, water was often unsafe to drink, contaminated by waste or stagnant storage. Brewing, with its boiling, fermenting, and spicing, made liquids safer and more nourishing. Beer wasn't only a treat, it was a survival tool. For monks, it was also a practical gift to pilgrims, travelers, and the sick, offering hydration without the dangers of untreated water. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some monasteries, wells were considered holy, and beer brewed with their water was thought to carry divine blessing. Imagine sipping a pint and believing not only that it quenched thirst, but that it also tucked a little prayer into your bloodstream. Not a bad incentive to drink up. Historians still argue whether monks chose their brewing sites primarily for religious reasons, sacred springs, holy rivers, or for practical ones like reliable fresh water. Was the holiness of a spring the reason for the brewery, or did the brewery make the spring holy in hindsight? The debate trickles on, like water over stone. You sit on the edge of the trough as monks haul buckets, their movements practiced and soundless. They carry the water back into the brewery, where the malt will meet this clear, cold gift. The silence is unbroken, but the rhythm of labor feels like a chant in itself. You take one more sip from your cupped hands, the water sharp and pure, and realize that what begins here will soon be transformed into liquid bread, carrying both history and holiness in every drop. The buckets of water are poured into great wooden tuns, and the air fills with the earthy perfume of grain waiting for its companion flavors. You lean closer and notice bundles of herbs resting on a nearby table. Aromatic greens, dried flowers, even a few roots. The monks reach for them with care, as though handling relics rather than seasonings. Mainstream history explains that before hops became the standard, medieval beer was flavored with a mixture called Brewed. This blend might include yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, or heather, depending on the region and the season. Each abbey had its own signature mix, passed quietly from one generation of brewers to the next. It wasn't just about taste, it was about identity, a liquid fingerprint. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some of these herbs were mildly intoxicating or even hallucinogenic in high doses. Imagine finishing your mug and insisting you could suddenly see angels in the rafters. Whether that was divine revelation or just the bog myrtle talking, no one can say for sure. Historians still argue whether the transition to hops was driven by flavor preference, health benefits, or economics. Hops preserved beer longer, making it easier to store and transport, but some insist monasteries clung to their herbal Groot recipes for centuries out of tradition or stubborn pride. Did hops conquer taste buds or account books first? The answer remains as hazy as unfiltered ale. You watch as a monk crushes herbs between his fingers, the scent of bitter greens and sharp florals rising into the cool air. Another stirs them into the vat, the silence punctuated by the gentle splash of water against wood. The mixture thickens into something both pungent and promising. You breathe deeply, realizing that long before modern craft brewers bragged about unique recipes, monks were already flavoring their beer with the gardens of their cloisters, one quiet handful at a time. The vat steams gently, and you lean close enough to feel warmth rising off the surface. Bubbles begin to form as the soaked grain and herbs meet the fire's heat. The monks stir with long wooden paddles, their arms moving in steady arcs, faces serene despite the heaviness of the work. No one speaks, but the silence is alive, thick with expectation, as though each swirl of the paddle is a kind of prayer. Mainstream history tells us that fermentation was never fully understood in these centuries. Monks didn't know about yeast in the scientific sense, but they knew what worked. They noticed that leaving the mash exposed to the air, or adding dregs from an older batch, would spark bubbling and froth. These signs meant the mysterious transformation had begun, grain water into beer. The process was magical, and perhaps that's why it was treated with such reverence. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some abbeys, the froth itself was considered a blessing. Accounts suggest that monks scooped it off and offered it to the sick, believing the foam carried healing properties. Imagine being bedridden, and a monk arrives saying, "Here, sip some of this bubbling head, good for what ails you." Questionable bedside manner, but at least the prescription came with a buzz. Historians still argue whether monks truly believed fermentation was divine intervention, or if they simply accepted it as a mysterious natural process. Was yeast imagined as an invisible gift from God, or just an unexplained household magic? Without microscopes, the debate remained theological as much as practical. You bend over the vat and watch the bubbles rise, slow at first, then eager, bursting with tiny pops. The air fills with a yeasty tang, sharp yet comforting, like fresh bread baking in liquid form. Around you, the monks stir and skim, patient as stone, content to let nature, and perhaps heaven, do its unseen work. You descend a short stone stair into the monastery's cellar, the air shifting instantly from warm and yeasty to cool and damp. Here, the silence is even heavier, as though the thick stone walls themselves insist on stillness. The rows stretch before you, massive oak barrels bound in iron hoops, lined up like silent sentinels in the dark. The faint smell of damp wood mingles with the sharp tang of fermenting ale, a scent that seems both earthy and alive. Mainstream history notes that monasteries built cellars precisely for this purpose, to store and age beer in stable, cool conditions. These underground halls kept brews fresh, shielded them from heat, and allowed the flavors to mellow. Without refrigeration, a stone cellar was the closest thing to magic preservation technology. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some records suggest monks occasionally tapped barrels too soon, sipping half-fermented beer, because patience was, apparently, not always a virtue. The result was a frothy, sharp drink with unpredictable potency, something between medicine and prank. Imagine telling your abbot you were just testing quality after stumbling into Vespers. Historians still argue whether monks developed aging techniques intentionally, experimenting to refine taste, or if storage was purely practical, with improved flavor being a fortunate accident. Did they mean to craft smoother beer, or were they just grateful the brew hadn't spoiled yet? The debate remains barrel-shaped and unresolved. You run your hand along the side of one cask, the wood cool and slightly damp to the touch. A monk gently taps a plug from a barrel, filling a clay mug with a dark, foamy stream. He hands it to you without a word. The first sip is surprisingly rich, nutty, slightly sweet, with a bite of herbs still clinging to the back of your tongue. In the quiet cellar, surrounded by stone and wood, you realize that silence itself may be the final ingredient, allowing beer to rest, undisturbed, until it's ready for the world beyond the cloister's walls. Back above ground, you join the monks as they file into the refectory, the long wooden tables lit by tall beeswax candles. The benches creak as everyone takes their places, robes brushing the floor in unison. No voices greet you, only the sound of mugs being set down, bowls slid forward, and a single bell marking the beginning of the meal. Mainstream history tells us that beer was part of the daily ration in many monasteries, often replacing water entirely. For monks, beer wasn't indulgence, it was nourishment. Rich in calories, vitamins, and liquid, it provided energy for long hours of prayer and labor. In fact, beer was considered so essential that some abbeys allowed up to a gallon per monk per day, though usually divided across weaker brews. Here's the quirky tidbit. The so-called liquid bread nickname wasn't just poetic. During fasting periods when solid food was restricted, beer was sometimes exempt, which meant monks essentially lived on ale alone for weeks. You imagine them nodding solemnly through prayers, secretly congratulating themselves on having found the most satisfying loophole in history. Historians still argue whether the beer monks drank daily was truly nourishing, or if records exaggerated its health benefits. Was it really a balanced supplement, or simply the best option in a world without refrigeration or clean tap water? Evidence suggests it did provide real sustenance, but debates about its actual nutritional impact continue. You lift a clay mug, its rim rough against your lips. The beer is mild, lighter than the cellared sample you had earlier. It tastes wholesome, faintly herbal, with the comforting warmth of bread. Around you, monks sip slowly, their eyes lowered in contemplation, each mouthful part of a ritual rather than a diversion. In the silence of the hall, you realize beer wasn't just something monks brewed. It was woven directly into their way of life, sip by steady sip. The refectory empties slowly, mugs stacked neatly, candles guttering in their holders. But not everyone stays inside the cloister. Just beyond the abbey gates, a steady trickle of travelers, pilgrims, and weary merchants gathers. They know that within these walls lies not only prayer, but hospitality and beer. Mainstream history shows that monasteries became famous for offering lodging and sustenance to pilgrims. Beer brewed inside the abbey wasn't hoarded. It was shared with guests, who found it both comforting and restorative after long journeys. Many abbeys even built guest houses or small inns nearby, where a mug of strong ale was part of the welcome. For a pilgrim trudging dusty roads, nothing said, "You've arrived safely," quite like a foamy cup. Here's the quirky tidbit. Records describe some abbeys brewing different strengths of beer specifically for outsiders. Pilgrims and visitors sometimes got the good stuff, while monks themselves drank the lighter brew. Imagine being a monk, watching travelers sip happily from fuller mugs, while you nursed your watered-down portion. Patience, humility, and maybe just a pinch of envy. Historians still argue whether abbeys shared beer freely as charity, or whether it quickly became a source of income. Was the pint in your pilgrim's hand a gesture of Christian kindness, or a cleverly disguised business model? Surviving documents suggest both interpretations are possible, depending on the abbey and the abbot's philosophy. You step outside and see travelers slumped in relief, hands curled around mugs, laughter breaking out in accents from far-off lands. Their burdens ease as beer works its quiet magic, binding strangers into friends. Inside, the monastery remains hushed, but beyond the walls, voices rise in gratitude and song. In this mingling of sacred silence and worldly cheer, you sense the odd harmony of a tradition that served both God and weary humanity, one sip at a time. The courtyard grows quiet again, the last of the pilgrims drifting toward their beds. But within the cloister, order returns with the ring of a bell. You are led back to a small library, its shelves stacked with manuscripts, some of them containing more than prayers. Here, in careful script, monks record not only liturgy, but recipes, ratios, and rules for how much beer should be brewed and consumed. Mainstream history tells us that monastic orders often included specific guidelines about drink. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed a daily portion of a hemina of wine, but in many regions that was interpreted as beer instead, since grapes were scarce. Later rules in certain abbeys even specified how much ale monks could consume per day, sometimes reducing portions during Lent or substituting weaker brews. Discipline stretched all the way into the mugs. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some abbeys measured rations with containers shaped like monks' heads, filling them to the tonsure line. If your head was bald on top, so too was the jug. Pour until the line of hair ended. It was equal parts practical and cheeky, a medieval gag that monks themselves surely chuckled at behind solemn faces. Historians still argue whether these ration limits were rigorously enforced or quietly bent. Did monks really stick to their regulated half-liter per day, or did abbots look the other way as barrels emptied faster than records admitted? Surviving ledgers suggest both possibilities, with some monasteries reporting shortages suspiciously often. You picture the scene, a monk raising his clay cup, sipping slowly, making it last, while another watches the bottom of his mug far too soon. There's no argument, no noisy complaint, only the silent endurance of rules, perhaps softened by a wink from the brother serving refills. In that quiet hall of regulations, you realize beer wasn't just sustenance. It was also a test of obedience, a measure of faith as much as thirst. You wander deeper into the cloister, and the quiet is broken only by the muted thump of wooden mallets and the scrape of stone floors. In the brewery hall, the brothers are gathered again, but this time the mood feels inventive, almost experimental. You notice notebooks spread on a bench, filled with neat lines of script, diagrams of barrels, and small sketches of herbs. Brewing here isn't just routine, it's innovation. Mainstream history recognizes monasteries as some of the earliest centers of brewing science. They refined techniques like controlled malting, systematic boiling, and careful yeast management long before universities studied such things. In fact, many modern beer styles trace their origins to monastic recipes, which were recorded, preserved, and improved over centuries. Each abbey became its own quiet laboratory, run not with fanfare, but with silence and patience. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries pioneered the use of glass flasks and even primitive thermometers to test consistency. Imagine a monk in full robe peering seriously at bubbles through a bit of glassware that looks suspiciously like a potion bottle. Brewing science and alchemy blurred together, and the result was beer that tasted better, lasted longer, and became famous far beyond the cloister walls. Historians still argue whether these advances were deliberate experiments or happy accidents carefully noted down. Did monks truly grasp the variables at play, or were they simply very good at observing patterns and copying what worked? The debate is lively, much like the bubbling vats themselves. You stand among the barrels and watch as one monk adjusts a fire under the kettle, while another sprinkles herbs with a steady hand. Each gesture is calm, precise, and purposeful, as though guided by centuries of practice. The silence amplifies the scene. No arguments, no wasted chatter, just the quiet pursuit of perfection, one batch at a time. The brewery doors close behind you, and you drift into a chamber that smells less of barley and more of sharp herbs and honey. Shelves line the walls, stacked with jars of dried plants, bundles of roots, and vials of thick liquids. The monks here move with the same quiet devotion, but what they're brewing now isn't just for thirst, it's for healing. Mainstream history reminds us that monasteries served as centers of medicine throughout the Middle Ages. Beer, infused with herbs and spices, became one of their remedies. A mug wasn't only sustenance, it could be a prescription. Monks added ingredients like juniper, sage, or even honey to treat ailments ranging from stomach aches to sleeplessness. A strong ale might warm the body during fevers, while a lighter herbal brew could soothe the digestion of weary travelers. Here's the quirky tidbit. One record describes monks mixing beer with egg yolks and herbs to create a tonic for coughs. Imagine being handed that concoction, frothy, herby, eggy, and being told to drink up for your health. You'd probably feel better just to avoid a second dose. Historians still argue whether these medicinal beers were genuinely effective or mostly placebo wrapped in ritual. Did the herbs truly deliver healing, or was it the comfort of warm liquid, the safety of the monastery, and the confidence in God's blessing that brought relief? The truth is likely a bit of both. Biology and belief working hand in hand. You sip from a clay cup offered by a monk, the liquid dark and slightly sweet, with the sharp edge of rosemary tingling your tongue. The silence deepens around you as he raises his hand in blessing before turning back to his jars. Here, beer becomes more than nourishment or indulgence. It becomes medicine for body and soul, brewed in the same patience and quiet as prayer. You slip into the chapter house, where the air is heavier with incense and the scrape of chairs on stone. Here, the monks gather not to stir grain or herbs, but to weigh questions of conscience. Beer may be sacred duty, but it also brings profit, and profit has a way of stirring unease, even in cloistered silence. Mainstream history shows that by the high Middle Ages, monastic beer had grown famous well beyond abbey walls. Travelers, merchants, even nobles sought it out, and abbeys began selling surplus to towns. For some orders, this meant steady income that funded libraries, hospitals, and charity. But for others, it sparked tension. Was commerce compatible with vows of humility? Here's the quirky tidbit. Some abbots tried to solve the moral dilemma by pricing beer oddly, charging not in coins, but in loaves of bread, wax, or promises of prayer. Imagine paying for your pint with 3 candles and a Hail Mary. It sounds like a gimmick, but it was a genuine attempt to keep trade from feeling too mercantile. Historians still argue whether monasteries drifted into proto-capitalist businesses or remained essentially charitable institutions. Were monks brewing for the glory of God while quietly padding their treasuries? Or were they reluctant entrepreneurs dragged into economics by the popularity of their product? Both stories find evidence in scattered documents, leaving the picture as cloudy as unfiltered ale. You picture the chapter house alive with silent gestures, abbots clearing throats, decisions weighed carefully under arched ceilings. Perhaps one monk raises a finger, signaling dissent. Another strokes his tonsured head in thought. In the end, barrels still leave the abbey gates, whether for coin or for alms. The silence doesn't erase the tension, it only frames it. And in that quiet, you realize monks weren't just brewers of beer, but brewers of compromise, balancing faith, need, and the irresistible demand for a good drink. The chapter house fades into quiet, and you step once more into the courtyard where the evening bell tolls low and steady. The day's brewing is finished, the fields lie still under starlight, and barrels rest in the cool hush of the cellar. You pause, mug in hand, and realize that every sip you've taken tonight carries not just malt and herbs, but centuries of silence and devotion. Mainstream history tells us that monastic brewing never vanished. From the early Middle Ages through the Renaissance and beyond, monasteries preserved techniques, recipes, and traditions that shaped modern beer. Even today, Trappist monasteries in Belgium and beyond still brew ales renowned across the world, their labels bearing quiet echoes of vows made long ago. When you see Trappist stamped on a bottle, you're drinking history that never broke its rhythm. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some abbeys became so famous that locals nicknamed their beers liquid sermons. The joke went that a single pint could teach humility faster than an hour in the pews. Perhaps not the intended lesson, but one suspects the monks tolerated it with a faint smile. Historians still argue whether monastic brewing shaped beer as an industry more than secular guilds did. Were monks truly the fathers of modern brewing science, or did they merely preserve methods others would have developed anyway? The debate remains, but what can't be denied is that monastic silence gave beer a continuity and stability that few other institutions could match. You sip one last time, the taste earthy and mellow, and watch the cloister darken as candles gutter low. In that silence, you sense the weight of history, hundreds of years distilled into a humble drink. Beer, born of grain, water, herbs, and patience, brewed by hands that never sought fame, only devotion. And yet, their legacy lingers in every foamy glass raised today. The cloister is quiet now, the brewery cold and still. The scent of malt has faded into stone, and the last of the candles sputters out, leaving only the hush of night. You breathe slowly, deeply, letting the cool air fill your lungs, as steady as the rhythms that guided the monks for centuries. Imagine the barrels resting in the cellar, undisturbed. The beer inside matures gently, bubbling faintly in its sleep, as if even the liquid remembers the vow of silence. The monks themselves are at rest, robes folded neatly, their breaths rising and falling in unison like a soft chant. Work and prayer, grain and water, silence and sip, all woven together until there is no distinction. Your body feels heavier now, comfortably so, like a cask settling into its place. The sounds of the day, bells, paddles stirring vats, the shuffle of sandals, have softened into memory, leaving only calm. Even the debates, the doubts, the small jokes about tonsure mugs and liquid sermons dissolve into gentle echoes, harmless and light. The night stretches on, but there is nothing left for you to do. The fields are planted, the barrels sealed, the beer brewed. You've walked through centuries of quiet labor, and now the story can rest. As you will, close your eyes. Let the silence wrap around you like a cloak, soft and steady. The monks will keep brewing tomorrow, as they have for generations, and the legacy will flow on without your effort. For tonight, all you need is stillness, a deep breath, and the slow fade into dreams.